Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Well, just over 2 weeks remain in the 2019 legislative session, and Minnesota lawmakers on the conference committees are working through the weekend trying to reconcile the major omnibus bills. This will be our final show of the session and your final opportunity to call the studio with questions for our local lawmakers. You can call the studio with your questions by dialing 218-788-2844 or our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. You can also email your questions to askmlr@wdse.org. Now let's introduce the legislators who are joining me in the WDSE studio, beginning with Representative Mary Murphy, a DFLer from Hermantown. Welcome back.
Hi, Greg.
And Senator Erik Simonson, a Democrat from Duluth. And thanks for being here. Thank you. And we should say that several lawmakers had to cancel because of the the conference committee schedule. So we're going to make it through with our two lawmakers here today, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And I wanted to start out, Senator Simonson, talking about those conference committees. There's a number of major omnibus bills that the conference committees are working on. Have you heard any updates at all on any progress through the weekend so far?
There's not been really any progress. There's been a few conference committees that have met, but we're waiting for staff to get some of the comparison documents together and prepared. So I think the majority of the work will probably begin tomorrow. I know my conference committee that I'm on meets tomorrow, and we expect to put in probably a good 10, 12-hour day.
A lot of long days coming up here for everybody in the legislature. Representative Murphy, tomorrow, according to the schedule that was set, the aggressive schedule that was set at the beginning of the session, fiscal targets are going to come out with the governor and the leadership at the House and the Senate. Tell people a little bit what the importance of those fiscal targets will be to getting things finished here at the end of the session.
Well, they're absolutely essential. And the governor and the Senate and the House leaders are working on what those amounts can be. That will be the most realistic number we've had so far for the various fiscal bills, that amount of spending that we're making and amount of taxing that will be done.
And Senator Simonson, those targets basically tell each of the conference committees how much money they have to spend on each of those different finance bills?
Correct. That kind of gives you, and that's why they call it the target, because that is your spending target. And now the bill will have to confine with the limits of that target as it comes out of there. And I think our goal, our deadline to get them out of conference and onto the floor is on the 13th of May.
So it sounds like we can expect quite a bit of movement maybe this coming week, Representative Murphy. We'll start to see maybe how these conference bills will be coming together.
Yes, and really, we can't predict what's going to happen, but we're further ahead than we've ever been at this point in time in the years that I've been at the legislature. And we had these common dates that were set by the House and the Senate that they were going to be finished by a certain amount of time, and that starting tomorrow will be the time for conference committees to meet. And we've always had conference committees meeting at the same time that fiscal bills were being heard on the floor. And that was always kind of a conflict, because then we had to wait and have longer and longer hours. But now one of the goals was that we were going to do conference committees in the light of day. Mm-hmm. And so that'll be a first. And conference committees take a long time, because first of all, you have to go through the House positions and you have to go through the Senate positions. And then they adopt the things that are same or similar. Mm-hmm. And then come the complex issues of where we're further and further apart.
And I did spend some time on Friday watching the Health and Human Services Conference Committee, which went to work right away Friday morning. I think the Commissioner of Health, Jan Malcolm, was there, and she was going through item by item And these bills are just huge, Senator Simonson. They deal with so many parts of government.
Right. They are. They're very big. They're very large. There's a lot to do in a short period of time. And that is why the conferees really have to get to work as quickly as they can. And they have to, I mean, we do allow opportunities for public testimony, but at the same time, there's not a lot of time to get the work done. So we have a lot to do in about 5 or 6 days here.
But public testimony is, if there's questions about something, they ask somebody from the audience or the public that has some expertise on the matter of how it got through the House or how it got through the Senate. And so they're talking more in particular about the specifics of public testimony toward a specific point. And so it's not just like anybody can come and tell their story again. That's not done very much.
Okay, and we don't have anybody here who sits on Health and Human Services, but we are going to ask one question about Health and Human Services, and that's the 2% provider tax, which was going to be sunsetting this year. That's a controversial measure, Senator Simonson. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and where that 2% goes?
So the 2% provider tax is essentially a tax that's charged to virtually every healthcare invoice that comes through. If you think of it as a sales tax on healthcare, it's the same principle, and it's 2%. And this is historically what has funded our Minnesota Care program. About, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, the legislature decided that they were going to sunset the 2% provider tax at the end of 2019, which we are quickly approaching. So this has been the debate about if the provider tax goes away, as it will under current provision in law, how are we going to fund Minnesota Care? And B, if it doesn't go away, we need to replace it with some other funding mechanism. The legislature has not been able to come up with an alternative funding mechanism this year. So now we're at the point where we either need to extend that sunset or not. But if we do not, the HHS folks are telling us that we're leaving a huge hole in our HHS budget in the out biennium.
And Representative Murphy, Bill from Duluth he calls that tax an unfair provider tax, and he's wondering if it's going to continue. And that remains to be seen, right? Depends on what happens with the conference committee. It
remains to be seen, but I'm hopeful that it will be seen. I'm hopeful that we will keep it because it has worked. And if we don't have the provider tax, it comes out of the general fund money, and that is not sustainable for the kind of health care requests that we had for our state programs.
And Senator Simonson, that Minnesota Care really does help ensure the lowest income Minnesotans, those that can't get their own health insurance in other ways.
That's absolutely true. And there is some federal monies that come into that program, but not enough to sustain it. So we either have to continue that provider tax, whether we like it or not, or we have to find some alternative. And the time has run out on finding the alternative, so now we're down to the point where we probably need to extend that provider tax.
All right. Well, Representative Murphy, you are the chair of the Capital Investment Committee in the House.
Yes.
And several weeks ago, you presented a fairly robust bonding bill. So far, no movement on the Senate side. What's the latest update on a potential bonding bill for this session?
Well, we're not much further than we were the last time we talked about it, but there are more inklings that the Senate is willing to meet to have a smaller bonding bill than our robust ones. And I'm not sure, because I'm not part of the leadership mentions about it, but I'm not sure. We could do a smaller, but 66% of what the House bill has emergency or absolute necessary projects that have to be addressed soon. They are projects that have been set aside that are worn out or on state buildings and state investments that we've made, our colleges and university campuses, have a good share of that 66% of emergency needs. And there are about 23% of local governments that have emergencies also, in addition to that 66% that would like their projects addressed. And so there is a need for it. The other parts, roads and bridges, are local roads and bridges and non-trunk highway kind of funding is part of the bill. And those things are all things that communities are waiting for us to address.
And Senator Simonson, with the Republicans in charge in your body, the Senate, are you hearing any rumblings of a potential bonding bill from the Senate side?
So the Capital Investment Committee has not met this session, which is not necessarily unusual for them. You know, next year being what they would call the traditional bonding year. However, I would say that there are some rumblings starting. Oftentimes a small bonding bill comes out in the final days as part of a negotiated deal. So I think if there's going to be a deal at the close of this session, I think it's a good chance to think that a smaller bonding bill could come out of the Senate.
And,
Representative Murphy?
and I understand that the Senate Senate leaders have said, find out what 3 priorities are from each senator. And if that's the case, they're talking about 200 projects. And we don't have that many projects in our in our bills, so maybe they're ready to come way up.
Well, we'll have to wait and see these final few weeks of the session and see what happens, and keep watching Minnesota Channel for the latest update. One of the things that made the news this week, we'll talk about some this week news. Senator Simonson, Governor Walz signed a bill this week that eliminated an exception in the law for marital rape. It was kind of a old-fashioned law, I guess would be the best way to say it. Can you talk a little bit about that and the importance of taking that off of state statute?
I think this is the type of thing that most Minnesotans would be absolutely surprised that it was even in law to begin with. I certainly wasn't aware of it until I saw the bill come through this session, but we had it on the Senate floor several days ago, and it's very emotional. It's one of those bills that we all generally agree with the concept, and taking it out seems like the right thing to do, but a lot of emotional testimony, a lot of people watching from the gallery that had been affected by this in the past, and we're very pleased to see it moving forward, and we're all glad to see the governor sign it.
Similar situation on the House side. Was it emotional testimony?
Yeah. It went faster in the House than it did in the Senate, I believe, and there was less conversation. But the board just lit up green.
So that was kind of a slam dunk, and the governor signed it into law immediately last week. So. Representative Murphy, can you tell us what's been happening this session with higher education funding? Are there any changes to that or any updates on higher education funding?
Well, I don't know specifics, but yes, we passed the bill. And that too is going into conference committee. The conferees, I don't think have been appointed yet.
Okay. Any updates, Senator Simonson?
Well, I just know that the Senate higher education omnibus bill, I mean, the largest problem with it is just too small. The University of Minnesota had an ask, I think, in the neighborhood of $88 million. Minnesota State had an ask. And these are asked to just kind of keep the lights on, keep things moving, keep up with the rate of inflation without necessarily having to raise tuition for students. And I know the Senate provisions are far short of that. So we're hoping that what comes out of joint targets at least gets us back in the neighborhood of what they're looking for.
Representative Murphy, you're going through the spreadsheet, I see.
They did get appointed. They got appointed on May 1st.
And this is the conference committee?
Right. And so maybe they're going to meet tomorrow.
So there'll be a further update.
Right, and the House, the amount of money that was in the House bill was much more than the Senate had. All the all the bills that passed the House had more realistic numbers than what the Senate gave their committees.
All right, so that's another issue that you'll have to pay attention to
Or
as we
in my world, they're more realistic, but they were more, but they were responsible with the amount of money that the state has that they could spend for those issues.
And those issues, each university or each school themselves gives those numbers or says, here's what we need to keep the lights on, as Senator Simonson said?
Keep the lights on and the staff for the enrollment that's involved. And some of the state system programs have higher enrollment than they had before. So it's not, there's one or two that didn't, but there are some that are growing and for specific programs, and then you need more staff.
Right. Well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. This is your opportunity to call in with questions for the lawmakers who represent you, like Chris in Cloquet did. And Chris has a question, Senator Simonson. What happens to all the money that the government gets from drug busts or from people that get pulled over? Do you, I know you served on public safety when you were on the House side. What happens with that money? Does that go into the funding for those agencies or into the general fund, or?
Some of it is covered under Minnesota's forfeiture laws, and some of that funding goes to local jurisdictions. For example, our local, Lake Superior Gang and Drug Strike Force Task Force.
Yep.
Can't remember the name of it exactly, but
Task Force, I
a
believe.
lot of their funds don't come out of the city's general fund. A lot of their funds come from forfeiture money that comes from examples like that. And I know that there's a bill moving through the legislature this session that would really change the mechanism of how that operates and would really have an impact on their operating budgets. And it's a touchy subject, and I'm not quite sure if that bill's going to move or not, but those monies are generally reinvested back into law enforcement activities, to answer that question.
Okay.
And I think that it will, if the bill isn't moving, then it will become a discussion point for the Civil Law Conference Committee.
Okay.
Because there is a great conflict between those that are, they're using those funds, though the forfeiture funds are local police and sheriffs use that money for local projects or local things in their annual budgets, and there's other groups of people that say that's just not fair to the individuals that lose their truck or car because they were stopped.
Senator Simonson?
I think a good example that a lot of us have maybe forgotten about already is some of the money that was seized from the last place on earth. That money was actually used to buy our local police department's new record system. So that didn't come out of general fund. It wasn't taxpayer dollars. And you know, there's probably some room for discussion here, but I think at the end of the day, if we don't fund these police operations in that way, we're going to have to find other ways to fund them.
Mm-hmm. All right, Senator Simonson, John from Tower has a question, and he says, where do you think the final dollar amount for the broadband will end up? The $70 million that the House is proposing, or the $30 million that the Senate is proposing?
My guess is it's somewhere in between, to be fair. You know, 30 is actually a high number compared to what we've done in years past. But I think the governor has made it a priority. The House coming in at 70 has made it a priority for them. So I think something north of 30 is reasonable to expect.
You can tell John is paying pretty close attention. He knew the number in both bodies.
Right, that's good.
Representative Murphy, the House and Senate have both approved their public school funding. Both have a boost, but the House and Senate numbers are different. The House is higher, as you mentioned. Senate's quite a bit lower. What do you think? Are they going to find a compromise somewhere in the middle? I think it's 0.5% in the Senate and 3 point something on the House side. I'm not as sharp as John is on that.
Well, the figure that's in my mind, we have a $900 million House education, early childhood through 12th grade funding bill, and it funds the local communities per pupil at 3% increase the first year and 2% the second year. And school districts have testified that that would be acceptable and they would be able to cover their costs with that without having too many cuts in there. And they would also be able to hire like the school nurse and the school counselor and some people that they have not had at full-time or even had in some places at all. And so they're looking forward to, they're leaning toward supporting the House bill rather than the Senate bill. But if we're going to go to a compromise, I just think that we absolutely have to do better than half and half between that one, because school districts have been cheated for too many years and trying to catch up, and we haven't caught up, and we're missing too many, and the class sizes have grown too much, and schools have to be given some monies so that they can meet the needs of their particular goals and priorities in their local community. And so we've got to give the school boards that leverage.
And Representative Murphy, you serve on the E through 12 Education Finance Committee. Is there anything specific for our region that you talked about this session, or anything coming out of your committee that might be of interest to local viewers?
Well, the thing that has worked so well in Duluth, the full-service community schools, or the wraparound schools, or the schools that are open, like the Laura MacArthur and the Grant, and the schools that have had such success. 2 years ago, there was about money for about 29 schools in the state to ask for grants, about at $90,000 a school, to hire the persons that would do this across the state, in selected school districts across the state. But there were so many school districts that applied that didn't get that. And so that we increased the numbers of grantees to do that. And like at Lincoln, you know, it went from the grade school, elementary school, and then it went to Lincoln, and now it's at Danville. And so, because the kids have started out, and so it's been following the kids, and it has to follow all the way to senior year now. And they found that it's working so well, and they work with community resources, the county social services, and that kind of thing as well. And they have school open from 6 o'clock, it varies across the state in the grantee school districts now, but it's from 6 to 10 at night where the school is open, and it doesn't just serve the kids, it serves the families in some ways too. And so it's really a good example and a good model, and the people from Duluth have always come down to testify, and everybody gets their energy and excitement, and so we were able to have grants for that in the House proposal this year too, so there would be more statewide opportunities to join this kind of a model.
And Senator Simonson?
So you asked about local impacts in the E12 Education Finance Bill, and there's another provision in there too that I think is really important to draw attention to, and that is we have had for a number of years an issue with cross-subsidy and special education funding between ISD 709 and our local charter schools, and it's not unique to Duluth, it's a statewide problem. But this year, ISD 709 asked us for some help in trying to make some corrections here, because over the past 3 or 4 years, they have entirely depleted their reserve account, paying for these special education costs. And essentially, what happens is that when a child elects to attend the charter school and receive special education funding, the amount that's not reimbursed is charged back to the ISD 709, and they're paying far more through that process than they would if they were providing those services in their own schools. So it's an expensive route to go. It's still important, but we came forward with a bill with 3 pieces in it. One is trying to solicit or secure some money that would help rebuild the reserve fund. B, make an adjustment to the formula going forward, and C, putting a cap on the amount of money that could be billed back to the home school. And I know the financial pieces are in the House version of the bill, and we're going to work really hard to try to get that policy language in the Senate bill before it closes up that conference report.
And I think you've probably answered this pretty well, but Amy from Hibbing did have a question about, and you've been talking about what can be done about the caseload and the level of paperwork for special education teachers. Maybe if there was less paperwork, they'd have more time to spend with the students, but I don't know if that's something within your purview, Representative Murphy.
We're not sure about the paperwork. This is the 3rd year in a row that we've said that there has to be less paperwork, but it doesn't seem to be diminishing that much. If we don't have paperwork, the feds have paperwork. Requests, and so we're trying to address that, but we haven't addressed it in a manner that everybody believes.
And the state, I mean, the problem is that the state is really on the hook here because the federal government hasn't met their share of the responsibility. For a long, long time, they have not paid the amount of money to the state of Minnesota that they should be. So the state is on the hook to try to fill that gap, and when the state doesn't do it, then the local is trying to fill that gap, and that's why our districts are depleting their reserve accounts.
But last week when Congressman Stauber visited the House of Representatives, and we told him about that we had to have the federal amount they should be living up to their 40% as promised instead of the 17% that we've been getting from the federal government. And he said that he and Angie Craig are both working on this issue on the federal level, bringing their share up to 40%. So he was very well aware of our needs and seemed to have a handle on some ways of working to get more federal dollars back to us. So I'm hoping that together we all can be working together and our kids in special ed get a little bit more money and the ability to count on that the programs can continue on.
And this seems like an issue that cuts across partisan lines. I mean, it's not a nonpartisan issue.
It's all kids, it's all classrooms. It has an effect on all schools because these kids' needs have to be met.
All right, well, we'll wait to see what might happen with that. Senator Simonson, Senate Majority Leader Gazelka seems to be standing pretty firm on not allowing the gas tax to increase. What will that mean for transportation funding if there is not an increase in the gas tax this year?
You're right, he does seem to be standing pretty firm, and I wish he wouldn't maybe have gotten quite so firm because it kind of does close the door for end of session negotiations, but I think this gas tax really is a cornerstone of the governor's budget proposal. All the investments that we talk about making in E12 and HHS, public safety, our prisons, correction system, all of that really depends on freeing up some of those general fund dollars that are currently being spent on transportation. So I don't know that it has to be 20 cents to get the actual deal done, but there's going to have to be some new revenues there dedicated to transportation in order to free up those general fund monies. Otherwise, we're going to have a really hard time making some of these other targets work. I know just the E12 budget alone to try to do the 3 and the 2 on the formula, we don't have the money to do that if we're not able to raise some sort of a gas tax to free up those general fund dollars. And that's what I think is frustrating. Is it's tough when you say no, absolutely not, not knowing quite what the end of the game is going to be here yet. But we'll see. There's still a little bit of time.
And what kind of feedback are you getting from constituents? Do you hear much about the gas tax increase,
Yeah.
pro or con? Or?
I do. I hear a fair amount, and nobody wants to pay the gas tax, right? I understand that. I totally recognize that. But at the same time, we've not raised the gas tax for a long time. We definitely have needs. I mean, one thing that we all hear about, whether we're state elected officials or local elected officials, is the condition of our roads. They're horrible. So we've got to find new monies to invest in those transportation needs. And this right now is the mechanism that we have. And I realize that some people don't like it, but at the same time, the impact that it has on our economy is incredible. And we have to have safe roads, and we have to have good roads, and we have to have quality roads. And this is the way that we can pay for it. What the taxing mechanism looks 20, 30, 40 years from now may be entirely different based on how our transportation system is working, but for right now, we need this.
Representative Murphy, I think St. Louis County has an example of how they decided to help pay for roads and bridges, and that was the wheel tax that was passed a couple of years ago. Can you maybe address that and how that works and how it is working, I guess?
Well, that's in addition to, it's money in the St. Louis County for county roads, and they decide, they establish priorities, and then those priorities are, for St. Louis County, they go all the way from here up to Canada. So they try to have, just like the state DOT does, they try to establish priorities and a balance from one area to another area, so it's not all spent in one place kind of thing. But their wheelage tax then is able to add more miles to what the state programs are send back to the county for their programs. And so you might get 10 miles of road rather than 4 miles of road because of the two working together. And if they can, if you have some kind of long-range planning or mid-range planning, you can set your priorities so that you can get the most bucks and the most repairs for a road for the longest period of time by working together with the set amounts that are supposed to be coming from the state. And you know, people talk about the gas tax as it being something evil because it's something you can identify with. But the gas tax is such a, compared to the prices of gasoline that you see at the, you know, in Hermantown, at one station I saw yesterday, it was $2.69. In another place, it was $2.75.9. And so the gas prices are going up and down every day, and that's not the gas tax part of it that's doing that. Right. That's some other fluctuations that are far beyond the consumer's comprehension, and we can't do anything about that. So people say, no, we can't have more gas tax because we have no, that's the only thing that they feel that they can control. But if we don't expand, and we keep rewarding other kinds of fuel or electricity and not charging them an equal amount of money, we're going to go further and further behind. And people don't want that either. We've got to have some active money and some sustainable monies that are in our system, and we can't do it out of the general fund. Because if we're doing it out of the general fund, we're doing it out of senior citizen programs, we're doing it out of little children's programs, we're doing it out of the education programs. And roads and bridges have always been more of a thing by itself. And I just think we have to go back to that concept that the roads and bridges have to be sustainable for a long period of time, and we have to have plans of what's going to get repaired, when, and for how much.
And Senator Simonson, just to go down this road, pun intended, a little bit further, for example, next year a big project is going to start in Duluth. That's the so-called Can of Worms project. Now there's federal money involved in that as well. In a couple years from now, I understand they're going to replace the Blotnick Bridge because that bridge is aging out. So there's federal money involved. How does those two pots of money work together? Does the state and the federal money kind of work hand in hand on those projects?
Well, they do it in some projects like that where there's a mixture of state and federal roads in a broader project, then they do intermix the funds. Otherwise, they generally are required by either the Constitution or by law to stay incredibly separate, and there's firewalls between those funds, and rightly so. And that firewall continues all the way down to township roads and how they fund their roads and bridges too. But the gas tax is an interesting concept, because if you think back to when Duluth passed in the general election by about a 76% approval rate to impose a 0.5% sales tax to fund transportation. I mean, it's telling to me that people don't necessarily like taxes, but at the same time they recognize that it's important to have things done and have them done correctly. So I think, I hope that we get some sort of a deal at the end of this session that includes an increase, because if we don't start picking away a little bit more aggressively at some of our road and bridge problems statewide, we're going to have a serious problem in some areas of our state when it comes to trying to maintain their economies.
All right, well, we've addressed that issue. We'll move on to something else. Representative Murphy, Mary from Shakopee, and Guy from Moose Lake both had questions related to the Minnesota Sex Offender Treatment Program in Moose Lake. Mary is wondering, is the bonding money going to help speed up the process of getting sex offenders out of Moose Lake? And Guy was wondering, can we come up with a win-win situation for the Minnesota Sex Offender Treatment Program? Any bonding money involved in the Moose Lake Sex Offender facility?
No. St. Peter, but not Moose Lake.
Okay.
And there's some programming money also in the Health and Human Services bill for those programs, but there's no new money that will be coming in, I don't believe.
So no resolution for that issue,
No.
at least in the near term here. Senator Simonson, just last week we talked about MNLARS, and this week there was a pretty big announcement about MNLARS. The governor heard from the special state panel that recommended that the current MNLARS system that the state has spent a lot of money on is just not going to work out, and they recommend a packaged software solution. Tell folks what that means, what's supposedly going to happen here in the future with our licensing system.
The first I heard about that was when I saw it on the news, actually, over the week, and the very first thing I thought of, well, I just said on Sunday night that I think things are clicking along okay, but you're right. So there's been a special blue ribbon task force appointed by the governor to look at this issue, and the recommendation that they came back with was to 100% scrap MNLARS, buy an off-the-shelf commercial product that has worked in other states and implement that. I think the numbers that I have seen that it's probably not much more money to go with this commercial off-the-shelf product than it would be to continue down the path of MNLARS. And I readily admit that people are very frustrated with MNLARS and the process that has taken place over the last couple of years. So I'm hopeful, based on this recommendation, and the governor seems to be 100% behind it, of making this change in direction. And I'm hopeful that it works, because I think we have really kind of done Minnesotans a disservice by having this process. I know many of us are frustrated with the pace of the project and some of the challenges that it's seen, but if this is what we have to do to make it right, then that's what we have to do. And it's unfortunate that it came to this, but at the same time, maybe the end result will be better. Maybe this is the direction we should have gone to begin with.
You know, earlier in the session, there was some fairly impassioned testimony at committee level by registrars who apparently have had to spend some of their own money. And I guess I didn't understand why registrars would be spending their own money. Can you explain that? I mean, this is a state system, right?
Well, it's a state computer system is what it is, right? And I think some of the frustration that they're seeing is that those are private businesses that contract with the state.
Okay.
So when you're a private business, if you're losing a portion of your contract, you know, that hits your revenue stream hard, right? And these are revenues that they depend on. So they've seen some frustrations in terms of their customers not being able to get the product that they need. They have to go someplace else. They're losing that business, et cetera, et cetera. And they make a very good point. I mean, this is 100% the fault of MNLARS, this revenue that they're losing. And we did pass some legislation earlier in the session to try to give them some reimbursement, to try to make them probably not entirely whole, but at least try to get them back to where they should have been. And it's been very frustrating for them, and we feel for that. And that's why we passed and supported that bill earlier this session.
Representative Murphy, any thoughts on the MNLARS situation in this latest announcement this week?
No, but I think that it's good that we've gotten to this point and we've received the report and we can look at the report, but we also have to understand that it's still going to be 16 months before everything's back to normal or better than what it was.
Okay.
So it's going to take time still going forward to get everyone trained and to to decide on what the product is that we're going to buy. It has to be, my understanding is that at least 12 states already have to be using the program that we purchase.
In order to see that it's working well?
Right.
Okay.
We want at least 12 other models to go by.
Right.
And and that it's going to take 16 months before everybody's back and comfortable with whatever it is that we're going to deliver.
Okay.
So it's not going to be easy times yet.
I'm going to go back to something we talked about just a minute ago, because Hunter from Duluth was watching our conversation about transportation funding, and he wondered, what is the status of the City of Duluth's request for a 0.5% street tax? I don't think the legislature had moved on that last year. What's the update, Senator Simonson?
So the provision is in both the Senate and the House omnibus tax bills, and being in both bills, that stands a very good chance that it'll be in the final omnibus bill. So presuming that we have an omnibus tax bill at the end of this session, I feel pretty confident that it will be in there and it will pass.
And that's what you referenced earlier, Representative Murphy, the likes and the sames, or how did you phrase that when it's in both bills? It's
Same and similars.
same and similars. It's most likely going to be included in the final bill then.
And it's the exact same language, so it should pass without too much trouble.
All right, Representative Murphy, Larry from Hermantown has got a question. He's wondering about the gun legislation that is in the House side. He's wondering, Representative Murphy, why did you vote yes on the red flag gun confiscation and registration bill? So I guess he wants your reasoning for that, and then we can talk a little bit more about the likelihood of those measures passing.
It was part of the omnibus bill that was before us, and a small part. Not in the people's minds. I understand that. I understand that most of my constituents that have written to me said absolutely not. The red flag, not what's the other part?
The gun confiscation or registration
registration.
bill. Registration bill.
Those things, but we have to discuss it at some point. It has the gun ownership, gun use, gun anything about guns has not been talked about at the legislature for about 6 years in a serious way by the proper committees. And this went through the Judiciary Committee and was in the Judiciary and Civil Laws Committee, and it came out as a recommendation. These two bills came out as recommendations in that and was included in the omnibus bill. And if there's going to be any discussion, it has to be discussed in the House and it has to be discussed in the Senate. And if it's not going to be discussed, the hundreds of people that have come to the Capitol to be for or against the subjects are going to have to continue doing that. And we have to talk about the issue. People are talking about it in their families and at the coffee shops and in their schools. And the children are at schools are being put through exercises on what to do if their school is invaded in some way and so forth. And we have to come to some discussion between the House and the Senate. And that seems to be the only way that we're going to talk about it in both places.
And Senator Simonson, Majority Leader Gazelka said these issues are dead on the Senate side. They haven't moved on the Senate side. So is it likely that there will be anything that happens on these measures this session?
There won't be anything that happens this session. Senator Gazelka has made it very clear to his chairs that no hearings were to be given and that he wasn't going to entertain these. At one point in time during the session, I think he made the statement that if the House were to pass them standalone bills, then he would take them up, although you never know if that was true or not true. But I would agree with Representative Murphy that there's going to come a point in time where we need to have this discussion. And you know, it's a hard discussion to have because there are passionate arguments on both sides of the issues. But the only way that you can sort through those is by having the public hearings and having the discussions in the committees. And as you referenced, we've not had any of those discussions in the Senate at all this year.
Representative Murphy?
I think back in the 1990s, when one of my first major chairs of a finance committee was corrections and public safety and judiciary. For 6 years, I was chair of the finance committees that dealt with those subjects. Every single appropriation year, we had discussions about gun control and gun usages. Every year, we had something in our omnibus bill about gun usage and gun control. And it was an ordinary thing where you had people and you had discussions and we came up with consensus on what we could agree with. And those are the things that were in the bill, and those are things that are current law today. And if we don't get back to that kind of give and take and reaching consensus and through discussion, we're going to still be out here and here where do not, under any circumstances, vote for, do this. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some discussion and consensus building. Mm-hmm. And we can't just continue to say, we're going to be watching you, my group is going to be watching you, and you're gone if you don't obey us, kind of thing. The emails that I received were so polarized by both sides that I thought, there's no way I can win. But Larry doesn't have to worry because the Senate isn't going to take it up.
So we'll have to continue to talk, and maybe one day we'll come to some common ground.
Right, and maybe Larry and I could sit down and talk too. And I could hear where could there be consensus in his mind? What kind of issue could we have consensus on?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I think that's a call to action perhaps, so we'll see what happens. Representative Murphy, you've been involved in the House Legacy Committee for quite some time. This week there was quite a heated debate on the floor of the House before the Legacy Finance Bill was passed. Can you talk a little bit about what that was all about, and also just in general about the Legacy Bill that was passed by the House this week?
Well, the Legacy Bill is spending the money for the 4 funds that the people voted for in 2008. They agreed to pay 3/8 of a cent for Outdoor Heritage Fund, Clean Water Fund, Parks and Trails Fund, and Arts and Culture and History Fund. And we celebrated, there was a big celebration in March, I think it was March, at the Minnesota History Center, where the people that went out and worked for that appropriations bill and setting up those 4 funds that the people were asking for and that the people control pretty much. And there was a celebration of their 10 years, and so we have 15 years left before it comes to a conclusion or a restoration. But some people still have not, don't believe that some of the monies are used properly, and they had amendments. And mostly it's in the fund with the arts and cultural heritage, because that's the one that doesn't have a just one. There's 5 parts to that fund, and art seems to get the most hits. 47% of the 19% that the Arts Fund gets goes to the Arts Board. And there are questions about whether the Arts Board makes the right picks on who gets some money. And between that and the fact that the state is buying too much land, and the Outdoor Heritage Fund is eager for the state to have more state-funded land, land in our control. That just raises the hairs on the neck of all the Northwestern people that think the state owns too much land in the Northwest. And so those were the 2 major arguments about what kind of money is spent for arts, and too much money is spent for land acquisition.
So in the end, the bill did pass, however, and so
100 votes.
Okay, so it got pretty good. We just have a few minutes left, Senator Simonson. I want to get to the Senate Jobs, Energy, and Commerce bill, which was passed this week. Maybe talk about some highlights of that bill for folks who might want to know.
Right, in that conference committee, I am a conferee on that committee, so we'll be starting, the majority of that work will be starting tomorrow. But there are some, well, there's one big local provision in there people should be aware of, is that Verso is looking to change out one of their lines, and there's a $2 million loan in there for them to kind of match up against their $25 million private investment. Try to maintain those roughly 220 jobs out there at that paper mill. But there are a number of provisions in there for jobs all across our state. Our energy bills, Senate and House, are quite different, and I think it's not so much of a partisan difference as it is a geographical difference. There are big differences between XL service territory, Minnesota Power service territory, and trying to meet some of those different challenges in terms of their customers is going to be tough for us, I think, to figure that out. But there's a lot of discussion about how we increase our renewable energy standard and at the same time meeting the needs of our larger industrial and commercial users. So there's a lot of differences in that bill, but we'll see how it goes. Hopefully at the end of the day we can pass a good, robust jobs bill and make some good investments in Minnesota. That there's a lot of programs out there that do really good work in creating jobs and developing workers for the future. And that's really what the legislature should be about, is investing in those programs so that we have a strong economy going forward.
Well, we started the show talking about conference committees, and I guess we'll end it on conference committees. And I just wanted to, for viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with the legislative process, Senator Simonson, you've served on conference committees. You said you're expecting 10 to 12 hours of work tomorrow, and that's probably just the first day, right? So
it will be the first day, and I think the thing about conference committees is that the House and the Senate spend 4 months putting their bills together, and now they're coming together jointly for the first time, seeing the work of each opposing body. And in our case, we have a DFL-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, so the differences are going to be significant. And working out those differences and coming to agreement can be a real challenge, but it's especially challenges when you only have a week to do that work in. So when I say 10 to 12 hours, it really is probably 10 to 12 hours of just walking through the bill, understanding what the differences are, understanding what the financial differences are, and then we can start to go to work and try to figure out, okay, what are we going to compromise on? And this is that word that some people don't like, but compromise is the name of the game.
All right, and Representative Murphy, not as many sames and similars when the House and the Senate are led by different parties.
No, there aren't as many sames and similars. And so then you have to think, and you pretty well have to have the wording from one or the other in the final bill. And you can't amend the final bill that comes out of the final report that comes out of the conference committee. There's no amendments.
All right, well, that is all the time we have. I really want to thank you both for being here and helping us throughout the session, and good luck these last final weeks. We're going to say thank you to our viewers who called or emailed their questions today as well, and thank you for tuning in for the final edition of Minnesota Legislative Report for the 2019 session. For the crew here at WDSC, WRPT, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.